Hello, before we start, I would like to ask you a question. From the picture that I show you, can anyone guess what country is it from? That's right, Burma. Today we are going to teach and introduce you to Burma. Are you ready? Well, if you are, let's get started.
Burma facts. Myanmar, also called Burma, country located in western portion of mainland Southeast Asia. In 1989, the country's official English name, which it had held since 1885, was changed from the Union of Burma to the Union of Myanmar. In the Burmese language, the country has been known as Myanmar since the 13th century. The English name of the city that served as the country's capital from 1948 to 2006, Rangoon, also was dropped in 1989 in favor of a common Burmese name, Yangon. Land. The land is shaped like a kite with a long tail that runs south along the Malay Peninsula. The country is bordered by China to the north and northeast, Laos to the east, Thailand to the southeast, the Andaman Sea and Bay of Bengal to the south and southwest, Bangladesh to the west, and India to the northwest. People. Myanmar is a country of the great ethnic diversity. The Burmans, who form the largest group, account for more than half of the population. They are concentrated in Irrawaddy River Valley, into the coastal strips, with an original homeland in the central dry zone. The Karen are all only hill people who have settled in significant numbers in the plains, constituting about 1/10 of the population. They are the second largest ethnic group in Myanmar. The Kanya, who live on the southern edge of Shan Plantate, were once known as the Red Karen or Kareni, apparently for their red groups, although ethnically, linguistically Karen, they tend to maintain their own identity and hereditary leadership. The Shan of Shan Plantate have little ethno-linguistic affinity with the Burmans, and although historically led by hereditary rulers, their society was less elaborately structured than that of plains peoples. The Shan represent a small but significant portion of the country's population. The Irrawaddy and Sitang deltas were once populated by the Mon. The Mon were conquered in 11th century by Burmans, and by the end of 18th century, they had largely been incorporated into Burman society. However, the Mon will be discussed further in the slides. Numerous small ethnic groups, most of which inhabited the upland regions, together account for roughly 1/5 of Myanmar population. In the western hills and the Chinwin River Valley are various groups called the comprehensive name of Shan. The upper Irrawaddy Valley and the northern hills are occupied by groups under the comprehensive name of Kashan. These people long have had an association with the Burmans. During the period of British colonial rule, there were sizable communities of South Asians and Chinese, but many of these people left at the outbreak of World War II. A second but forced exodus took place in 1963, when commerce and industry were nationalized. In the early 21st century, the Chinese constituted a small but notable portion of Myanmar people.
The Mon were closely related to the Khmer, who lived to the east of the Mon in what is now Cambodia. The capital of the Mon probably was the port of Thaton, which was located northwest of the mouth of the Salween River and not far from the ported route of the Malay Peninsula. Through this window to the sea, the Mon saw India. The Mon culture was not displaced by Indian ways. The Mon blended the old with the new. They integrated many of their own beliefs into those of Theravada Buddhism, which arrived in Southeast Asia already replete with local South Asian beliefs. The power and prestige of the Mon kingship were enhanced by the notions of kingships found in India. The Mon developed a new art of sculpture by blending indigenous traditions with Gupta conventions of iconography, then built stupas, a Buddhist ceremonial mounds, according to Indian models which were adapted to Mon aesthetic tastes. The Mon subsequently became one of the most culturally advanced peoples in Southeast Asia. They assumed the role of teachers to their neighbors, spreading Theravada Buddhism and their new culture over the entire religion. The Mon center eventually shifted to Bago, located on the Bago River about 50 miles northeast of Yangon. For there, the Mon were able to control the trade of southern Myanmar.
Language. Many indigenous languages are spoken in Myanmar. The official language is Burmese, spoken by the people of the plains and as a second language by most people of the hills. During the colonial period, English became the official language, but Burmese continued as the primary language in all other settings. Both English and Burmese were compulsory subjects in schools and colleges. Burmese, Chinese, and Hindi were the languages of the commerce. After the independence, English ceased to be the official language, and after the military coup of 1962, it lost its importance in the schools and colleges. An elementary knowledge of English, however, is still required, and its instruction is again being encouraged. Religion. Although Myanmar has no official religion, nearly 9/10 of the population follows Theravada Buddhism. The vast majority of the Burmans and Shan are Buddhist. There is, however, a significant Protestant Christian minority, concentrated primarily among the Karen, Kachin, and Shin communities. Many of the other hill peoples practice local religions, and even those who adhere the world religions typically incorporate local elements to some degree. Muslims, mostly Burman, and Hindus are among the smallest religion minorities. Resources and power. Myanmar is rich in minerals including metal ores, petroleum, and natural gas, and also has significant deposits of precious and semi-precious stones. Although production generally has been increasing since the late 20th century, mining accounts for only a tiny fraction of the country's GDP and a comparable portion of the workforce. Large-scale exploitation of Myanmar mineral deposit began in the mid-1970s. Deposits of silver, lead, zinc, and gold are concentrated in the east, tin and tungsten in the Tinasarim region, and buried around the center of Burma. Copper mining began in the early 1980s and has been growing despite intermittent setbacks caused by shortage of food and supplies as well as by economic sanctions imposed by foreign government. When Myanmar was colonized by British in the late 19th century, the extraction of petroleum from the country's central region already was an established local practice. The industry was expanded by the British and since the mid-20th century by the government independent Myanmar. Although exploration for onshore petroleum resources since independence had not proved particularly fruitful. Exploration for natural gas has been especially productive. Myanmar also has major deposits of coal, and production rose sharply in the early 21st century. Coal is mined primarily in Upper Irrawaddy and Chinwin valleys. Government and society. Myanmar's first constitution came into force on January 4, 1974, the 26th anniversary of the country's independence, and was suspended following a military coup on September 18, 1988. The country was subsequently ruled by military junta known first as the State Law and Order Restoration Council, or SLORC, and between 1997 and 2011 as the State Peace and Development Council, SPDC. In 1988, the military took over control of the government. It established the SLORC as a new ruling body, and all state organs, including the People's Assembly and the Council of the State, were abolished and their duties assumed by the SLORC. The law designating the BSPP as the only political party also was abolished, and new parties were encouraged to register for general elections to new legislative assembly. More than 19 parties participated in the elections, which were held in May 1990. Of these, the most important were the dominant BSPP, which had changed its name to the National Unity Party, or NUP, and the main opposition party, the National League for Democracy, NLD. History. Myanmar has been a nexus of cultural and material exchange for thousands of years. Country's coasts and river valleys have been inhabited since prehistoric times, and during most of the first millennium Common Era, the overland trade route between China and India passed through Myanmar's borders. Merchant ships from India, Sri Lanka, and even further west converged on its ports, some of which also were the termini of the portage routes from the Gulf of Thailand across the narrow Isthmus of Kra on the Malay Peninsula. Myanmar has long served as the western gateway of mainland Southeast Asia. The origins of civilization in Myanmar. The first human settlers in Myanmar appeared in the Central Plain some 11,000 years ago. Little is known of these people except that they were a Paleolithic culture, using stone and fossilized wood tools that have been labeled by the Upper Burma. The discovery in 1969 by a worker from the government's Department of Archaeology, some cave paintings in stone tools in the eastern part of Shan State shows that they had a Paleolithic as well as early Neolithic about 10,000 years ago, both of which bore similarities to the Hoabinhian culture, which was widespread in the rest of Southeast Asia from about 13,000 to about 4,000 Common Era. Crude charts and ring stones found at the sites appear to have been attached to stone cutting tools to make them more suitable for digging. The wood cutting tools in the find probably were used to clear patches of forest for cultivation, which would indicate that the shift from gathering to horticulture had already begun.
Talking about the World War II and after the war. When World War II erupted in Europe in 1939, the Burmese leaders wanted to bargain with the government before giving their support to the British. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Aung San, but he escaped to China, where he attempted to solicit support from radical groups. Assistance came instead from the Japanese government. Aung San returned to Burma in secret, recruited 29 young men and took them to Japan, where these 30 comrades, including Nervin, who later became the head of the state, received military training. The Japanese promised independence for Burma. Hence, when Japanese troops reached Bangkok, Thailand in December 1941, Aung San announced the formation of the Burma Independence Army, or BIA. The Japanese advanced into Burma and by the end of 1942 had occupied the country. They subsequently disbanded the BIA and formed a smaller Burma Defense Army with Aung San still as a commander. Meanwhile, Thailand was given territory in the Shan state for its support of Japan's wartime efforts. Those lands were returned to Burma in the post-war period. During the war, Aung San and the Thakins formed a coalition of political parties called the Anti-Fascist Organization, or the Anti-Fascist People's Freedom League, shortened as AFPFL, which gained wide popular support. After the defeat of the Japanese in Burma in May 1945, the British military administration and members of the pre-war government who had returned from exile demanded that Aung San be tried as a traitor. Mountbatten, however, recognized the extent of Aung San's hold on the BNA and on the general populace, and he hastily sent the more conciliatory Sir Hubert Rance to head the administration. Rance regained the British the trust of Aung San and the general public. When the war ended, the military administration was withdrawn, and Rance was replaced by the former civilian governor, who formed a cabinet consisting of older and more conservative politicians. The new administration arrested Aung San and charged him with treason. With surprise and anger, the Burmese people prepared for rebellion. But the British government in London wisely reinstated Rance, who had proven himself a sensitive and successful administrator in Burma, as governor. Rance formed a new cabinet including Aung San, and discussions for a peaceful transfer of power began. These were concluded in London in January 1947 when the British agreed to Burma's independence. The communist and conservative wings of the AFPFL were dissatisfied with the agreement. The communists broke away and went underground, and the conservatives went into opposition. In July, Aung San and most members of his cabinet were assassinated by gunmen sent by Yu Sol, a former prime minister and now a conservative. Rance asked Thakin Nu to form a new cabinet, so as a consequence, a new constitution was written, and on January the 4th, 1948, Burma became a sovereign, independent republic.
Before the British conquest. Due to Burma location, it was a trade route between China and India. Both countries passed through, thus keeping Burma wealthy through trade. The Indian merchants traveled along the coast and the river where the majority of Burmese people live. This brought Indian cultural influence into the country, and it still exists today. The influence was the development of Buddhism in Burma. And did you know that Burma has been one of the first Southeast Asian countries to adopt Buddhism on a large scale? And it's continued even after British took over the country. Before the British conquest, Burma was ruled under the Khonbuang dynasty. that practiced a centralized form of government. The king was the chief executive with the final say on all matters. However, he could not make new laws. In addition, the king was in charge of all the hutto, but none of his orders got put into place until the hutto approved them. Provinces were also provided by governors, who was also appointed by hutto, and villages were ruled by hereditary headmen appointed by the king. Arrival of the British. Conflict between Burma and British began when the Konbaung dynasty decided to expand into Arakan in the state of Assam, which is close to British-held Chittagong in India. This event led to the First Anglo-Burmese War, where the British dispatched a large seaborne expedition that took Rangoon without any fight. Next, in Danupur, a Burmese general, Mahabandula, was killed, and his army routes. Burma was forced to cede Assam and other northern provinces. The Treaty of Yandabo officially marks the end of the First Anglo-Burmese War. Nevertheless, it was considered to be the most expensive war, and many soldiers from both sides died in the war. This also led to economic crisis in British India. In 1852, the Second Anglo-Burmese War was provoked by the British. They sought to take forests in Lower Burma, as well as port between Calcutta and Singapore. After the 25 peaceful years, British and Burma began to fight again until the British occupied all Lower Burma. In the Second Anglo-Burmese War, the British was victorious. As a result, they were able to obtain access to the teak, oil, and rubies of the newly occupied territory in Burma. Meanwhile, in the Upper Burma, where there are still some occupied territories, King Mindan has tried to adjust to the thrust of imperialism. He enacted administrative reform and made Burma more similar to the foreign interests. However, during the Third Anglo-Burmese, the British accused the independent king of Burma, Thibaw Min, as a tyrant, and that he tried to introduce French influence to Burmese people. British troops then entered Mandalay on the 28th December 1885 and occupied all area of present-day Myanmar. They made the territory a province of British India on January 1886. Early British rule. Burmese armed resistance actually continued for several years. They continued in northern Burma until 1890s, and British finally resorting to the systematic destruction of villages. The British then appoint the new official to halt all guerrilla activity. Traditional Burmese society were drastically affected by the demise of monarchy and the separation of religion and state. Furthermore, intermarriage between Europeans and Burmese also gave birth to indigenous Eurasian community known as Anglo-Burmese that later dominated the colonial society. Even after the British occupied Burma, they continued to send tribute to China to avoid offending them. On the other hand, the Chinese would recognize British occupation in Upper Burma. Administration. The British controlled the new territory through direct rule and makes many changes to the previous governmental structure. Firstly, the monarchy was abolished, and King Tribble was sent into exile. Religion and state were also separated. This was harmful because the Buddhist monk, the Sangha, were strongly dependent on the sponsorship of the monarchy. Moreover, the monks were also the representative of Buddhism that gave public the opportunity to understand national politics in greater degree. Economic. For Burmese, trade was not as important as self-sufficient agriculture. However, the country's location on major trade route between China and India did help them to gain significant amount of money. With the arrival of British, the Burmese economy became tied to the global market and was forced to become part of the global colonial export economy. The British exploited the rich soil of the land around the Irrawaddy Delta and cleared away the dense mangrove forest. During that time, rice was in high demand in Europe, so the British increased the production of rice. How do they do that? Well, to prepare the new land for cultivation, Burmese farmers has to borrow money from the Indian money lenders. Thousands of Indian labor also migrated into Burma. Moreover, these immigrants' willingness to work at lower wages makes them replace Burmese farmers. As a result, many Burmese villagers become unemployed. With the fast-growing economy, it was followed by the emergence of industrialization. Railway was built. There was also hundreds of steamboats that travel along the river. All of this transportation was owned by the British. The society had changed so quickly that at the end, some people gained nothing at all. The ethnic Burmese were excluded in many services, while the Anglo-Burmese and Indian got lots of benefit from civil service.
The British separated Burma province from British India in 1937 and also allocated the colony a new constitution calling for a fully elected assembly with many powers given to the Burmese, though this proved to be a divisive issue as some Burmese felt that this was a ploy to exclude them from any further Indian reforms, whereas other Burmese saw any action that removed Burma from the control of India to be a positive step. As gaining independence, Bamol finally stepped up as the first Prime Minister of Burma, but he was forced out by Yuzhal in 1939, who served as a Prime Minister from 1940 until he was arrested on 19 January 1942 by the British for communicating with the Japanese. Due to the strikes and protests that were coming from the oil fields of central Burma in 1938, it had elevated into a general strike with pervasive consequences. What I mean by that is, after successfully picketing the Secretariat, the seat of the colonial government, Rangoon student protesters were charged by the British Mounted Police wielding batons and killing a Rangoon University student called Eung Kyeol. In Mandalay, the police charged into a crowd of protesters led by Buddhist monks, killing 17 people. The movement became known as Tong Thon Ya by I Daobon, or the 103,000 Revolution, which named after the Burmese calendar year and 20 December, the day the first martyr Eung Kyeol fell, commemorated by students as Bo Eung Kyeol Day. Going back to the early 18th century when Britain marched into Myanmar, a Buddhist country rich in natural resources. The education system in Burma was one of the areas in which profound changes had taken place. But how Britain transformed the Burmese education system during the mid-19th century to early 20th centuries? Well, I'll guide you through the answers. In the pre-colonial period, education and religion were inextricably linked as the Theravada Buddhist monastic order, or the Sangha, served as the main educational institution for the natives. However, after Burma was colonized, the British attempt to reform the existing system initially by working to incorporate more secular subjects into the monastic curriculum, and later on, they set up a system of secular schools that could supply them with local administrators and civil servants and enable them to civilize the Burmese people. Due to the rise of the nationalistic in the 20th century, the educated Burmese demanded education reforms, leading to the establishment of many national schools that endeavored to rebuild a sense of national identity. Talking about schools in Burma before the arrival of the British, only few private schools existed except those established by Christian missionaries. For the local cloister, the self-contained agricultural villages were the center of culture and particularly served as schools for the Burmese boys. Similar to other countries where women were restricted in roles, girls were educated at home by parents who taught them basic literacy skills along with other skills that are related to efficacy in home duties due to religious restrictions set against women. Schooling is reflected by the fact that the Burmese word for school, or kyong, is the same word used to refer to the monastery, though the education was of a religious nature. The monastic schools ensured that Burma had a high literacy rate of about 60%, as the majority of Burmese men were at least able to read and write their basic letters. The monastery schools were completely independent from government control, while the Buddhist monks were enlightened about their duties as the schoolmasters by learning the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Moreover, their work was supported by voluntary gifts, donation, and alms from the villagers. All of that allowed the monks to contribute education with free of charge to all boys in the village, regardless of their class or religious background. Aside from monastic schools, a few other avenues of education were also available to the Burmese males. Vocational education was learned in a hands-on manner, with students taking up actual apprenticeships. The Burmese kings also sent men to Calcutta and attend higher learning institutions to acquire other sorts of training in the medical or technical fields. Prior to 1854, the British had a laissez-faire policy in regards to education. The British had a policy of conciliation since the early 19th century, and to avoid confrontation with the local population, they did not try to change the education system, which was linked to religion. However, as mentioned before, Western education schools had already been established by Christian missionaries in the rural areas populated by non-Burman ethnic tribes such as the Karens, Kushans, and Shins. While the missionaries' efforts with the Burmans and Chans, who were devout Buddhists, were met with resistance, they successfully educated some of the minority groups and also converted them to Christianity. These schools educated both male and female students. Starting in 1854, the British authorities extended their influence into the education system with the goal to convey useful and practical knowledge suited to every station in life to the great masses of people, as well as to spread civilization, to remove superstitious prejudices, as well as to use education to attach subjects more closely to British rule. Although a few monasteries were receptive to the idea of improving their curriculum and accepted secular textbooks from the British, most monasteries resisted the change. Monks refused to teach subjects like geography and science, which they considered to be evil, and refused to play the layman, to be supervised by the layman, to keep lay attendance registers, to exercise lay discipline, and to use lay books. By 1871, the British authorities set up a system of lay schools under the control of a Director of Public Instruction and his inspectors. Later on, three main types of schools were established: vernacular schools, Anglo-vernacular schools, and English schools. These schools had taught the 3 R's as well as subjects in science, British history, and the British Constitution. The language of instruction was Burmese in the vernacular schools and English in the English schools, while Anglo-vernacular schools used both languages for instruction until the 8th standard and English becomes the sole language of instruction. There are also some conditions going on, as students had to pay a fee to attend these schools, and those who could not pay continued to attend monastic schools. Those who displayed high academic ability in vernacular schools were given financial aid, and other bridge program provisions were made for them to transfer into Anglo-vernacular schools. While the aim of the Sangha was to teach the boys how to live, but not merely how to make a living, the modern schooling system, based on Western ideologies, taught students skills that had market value and that had led them to contribute to the economy to the benefit of their colonizers. Students were trained for vocational jobs or low-skilled jobs so that they could enter the workforce and help the British maximize their economic profits. And the base of them attain higher education that allowed them to work in the colonial administration. The British education system did, however, have a positive effect on female education and increased female literacy because women were permitted to enroll in these lay schools. At the turn of the 20th century, education received from the schooling system established by the British ironically contributed to the nationalist movement in two ways. First, while more people had earned higher degrees to enter government posts, most available posts for the Burmese had been filled by 1930. The frustration of university students was manifested in strikes and protests, which affected the economic decline in Burma. Second, education empowered the Burmese people to fight for liberation from their Western colonizers. To explain more, the Burmese who had gone abroad for further studies returned with both a realization of how they had been second-class citizens in their own country that was being exploited by the colonizers, as well as new ideas about government and politics. A nationalist group called the Young Men's Buddhist Association, or YMBA, that was modeled after the Young Men's Christian Association, began to organize and were later joined by other university student-led groups such as the Taken Group and We Burmans Association. They began to use print materials to mobilize nationalist sentiments across the nation. The Burmese began to realize that the knowledge of Burmese literature had almost died out, and that, aside from rural areas, English had become the main spoken language as Burmese language, and literacy were not sufficiently taught in schools attended by the majority of students. The YMBA, based on its motto and actions, implicitly seemed to acknowledge that modernization was necessary and did not completely discard modern education. But at the same time, concerned about the influence of Western education on the national identity, they tried to support schools that had Buddhism in the curriculum. The nationalists also supported monastic schools, petitioning the government to exempt these schools from taxation and discouraging costly religious rituals in these schools. The YMBA agitated the government further to establish more national schools that were independent from the British education system, where Burmese was the language of instruction. Their aim was to establish a system that could compete with the British system and eventually supplant it.
In the 18th century, Burma was not of particular interest to other countries. Later on, European traders started the expansion of their traditional influence in the western area, for example, Assam, Manipur, and Arakan. However, the British East India Company, or the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, also was expanding its interests eastwards over the same territory. The headquarters of the British East India Company is in London, Great Britain. This company rose to account for half of the world's trading during the mid-1700s and early 1800s. The basic commodities are cotton, silk, indigo dye, salt, spices, saltpetre, tea, and opium. In the next 60 years, diplomacy, raids, treaties, and compromises, known collectively as the Anglo-Burmese Wars, continued until Britain proclaimed control over most of Burma. All of Burma then came under the British rule. After the fall of Mandalay and being combined on January 1st, 1886. There are many Indians who arrived as soldiers, civil servants, construction workers, and traders, and along with the Anglo-Burmese community, dominated commercial and civil life in Burma in the colonial era. The capital of British Burma and the important port between Singapore and Calcutta is Rangoon. At that time, there were some British disrespectful of Burmese culture, like when the British refused to remove the shoes when they entered pagodas. In this event, Yuvisara, who was a Burmese Buddhist monk, died because of hunger strike against the British rule in Burma after his 166th day in prison. Later on April 1st, 1937, Burma then became a separately administered colony of Great Britain. Burma's first Prime Minister and Premier of Burma was Ba Maw. In the World War II, he resigned from the Legislative Assembly and was arrested for sedition. And later in 1940, before Japan entered World War II, the Burma Independence Army formed by Bokyok Aung San in Japan. As an important battleground, Burma was destroyed during World War II by the Japanese invasion. Within months of their entry into the war, Japanese troops advanced the Yangon and British rule collapsed. The Burmese administration led by Burma was founded by the Japanese in August 1942. Wingate's British Shindids formed a long-range drill group trained to operate along the Japanese landscape. Beginning in late 1944, the Allied forces launched a series of offensives leading to the end of Japanese rule in July 1945. Although many Burmese initially fought for Japan as part of Burma's independence army, but many Burmese, mostly from minorities, have served in the British Burma Army. The Burma National Army and the Arakan National Army fought Japan from 1942 to 1944, but changed allegiance to the Allies in 1945. The diplomatic relations of the country, especially with the West, have been tense in the past. However, the situation has improved significantly since the post-election reforms in 2010. After years of diplomatic segregation and economic and military sanctions, the United States eased its foreign aid to Myanmar in November. On January 13, 2012, the European Union imposed sanctions on Myanmar, including weapon embargo and the end of diplomatic relations, curbing all commercial needs and aid except humanitarian aid. Sanctions imposed by the United States and European countries on former military affairs, coupled with direct pressure on boycotts and other companies by supporters of the democratic movement, have withdrawn most US and many European companies. On April 13, 2012, British Prime Minister David Cameron suspended economic sanctions on Myanmar after the Democratization Promotion Party won 43 out of 45 seats in the 2012 sub-election, with leader Aung San Suu Kyi becoming a member of the Burmese parliament. Despite the isolation of the West, Asian companies were generally willing to continue investing the country and start new investments, especially in the mining of natural resources. The country has close ties with neighboring India and China, and again, several companies in India and China operate domestically. In 2008, India suspended military aid to Myanmar over the issue of human rights abuses by the ruling junta. The thaw in religions began on 28 November 2011 when Belarusian Prime Minister Mikhail Myansnikovich and his wife Ludmila arrived the capital Naypyidaw, the same day as the country received a visit by U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who also met with leader Aung San Suu Kyi, pro-democracy opposition. International relations progress indicators continued in September 2012 when Aung San Suu Kyi visited the United States, followed by Myanmar's reformist president visit to the United Nations. In May 2013, Thein Sein was the first Myanmar president to visit the White House. The last Burmese leader to visit the White House was Nevin in 1966. President Barack Obama praised a former general who reformed politics and economy and ended tensions between Myanmar and the United States. Political activists opposed the visit over concerns about human rights abuses in Myanmar, but Obama insists then saying Burma would have U.S. support. The two leaders discussed the release of more political prisoners, reforming the political system in the rule of law, and ending ethnic conflicts in Myanmar. The two governments agreed to sign bilateral trade and investment frameworks on May 21, 2013. In July 2019, UN ambassadors of 37 countries, including Myanmar, have signed a joint letter to the United Nations Human Rights Council, defending that China's treatment of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities groups in the Xinjiang region.
Before we go, here are the questions for you guys to answer.